What's good, y'all? It's your boy, the Virtual Gangster, and today we're gonna be talking about controllers. Now, I ain't talking about no PlayStation 5 controllers. We're talking about the Meta Quest touch controllers. So over the years, Meta has dropped several different controllers. With the Quest 2, they had the touch controllers. With the Meta Quest 3, they had the touch plus controllers. With the Meta Quest Pro, they had the touch pro controllers. They've had controllers upon controllers upon controllers. And today we're gonna find out what exactly is the best controller for you. So with the last two headsets, they kind of changed up the design. They switched up on us. They got rid of the tracking ring, and some people like it, some people don't. But we're gonna find out what is the best controller for you in your use case scenario in virtual reality. Are you a FPS shooter? If you're a VR chat furry, maybe a certain controller might be the best for you. We're gonna find that out right now. So, before we decide what controller is the best for you, I just want to take a second to step back and just lay out the theory of controller tracking in general. So the Meta Quest devices use 6 degrees of freedom inside-out tracking. There's also outside-in tracking where you would need base stations, but we ain't really talking about that. This inside-out tracking is executed by placing infrared LEDs on the touch controllers. The controllers emit a light source, and the cameras placed on the headset can detect that light source. With this, the position of the controllers can be triangulated relative to the headset. But all tracking between the headsets aren't the same, and I'll explain that a little bit later, but first, let's get a bit technical. Now would be a good time to mention that if this video is adding value in any type of way, please consider dropping a like, because we're about to go to school, so buckle up. Okay, previously I had mentioned 6 degrees of freedom tracking. Now you may be wondering, TVG, what the heck is 6 degrees of freedom? Well, let's go ahead and find out. If you imagine a physical space with an x-axis, a y-axis, and a z-axis, hence the name three-dimensional, the degrees of freedom relate to the number of ways a solid object can move in that said space. In total, there are 6 degrees of freedom categorized by 2 different types of movement along each of those axes. So, these 2 types of movements are translation and rotation. We have translation in the x-axis, which is also known as sway. There's also translation in the y-axis, which is also known as heave. And lastly, there's translation in the z-axis, which is also known as surge. For rotation, we have rotation about the x-axis, aka pitch, where you are moving in the YZ plane. Rotation about the y-axis, aka yaw, is where you're rotating in the XZ plane. And finally, rotation in the Z-axis, which is also known as roll, is rotating in the XY plane. And the combination of these 6 movements contribute to 6 degrees of freedom tracking. Alright, so cool. It sounds like we have a solid fundamental understanding of how the tracking works on the Meta Quest touch controllers. Now, earlier I had mentioned that the tracking between the different headsets aren't quite the same. So let's explore that idea. If you wanted to improve the accuracy of your tracking in the most basic way, there are 2 things you can do. You can increase the fidelity of your light emitting from your controller, make it stronger, add additional lights, or you can change the camera that's on the headset. You can increase the resolution, you can add additional cameras that maybe cover different angles and ensure that there are minimal blind spots in the tracking. Now, keeping that idea in mind, this proves that there absolutely is a difference in the accuracy of tracking between the different Meta Quest headsets. Now, the big question is this difference in accuracy of the tracking enough to impact your comfortability and performance in VR games? Okay, so keeping in line with the idea we just explored, I think it's pretty safe to say at this point that the Meta Quest 2 controller and the Meta Quest 3 controller are not backwards compatible, for lack of a better term. What I'm trying to say is that you can't use the Meta Quest 2 touch controllers on the Meta Quest 3, and you cannot use the Meta Quest 3 Touch Plus controllers on the Meta Quest 2. But you are able to use the Meta Quest Touch Pro controllers on both the Meta Quest 2 and the Meta Quest 3. And that's due to the fact that those controllers actually have their own cameras that can track themselves. So for this conversation, we're just going to exclude the Meta Quest Touch Pro controllers for the time being. So here I have an image straight from Meta depicting the tracking volume coverage for the MetaQuest 2 and the MetaQuest 3. Meta has actually said that in the MetaQuest 3, they maintain the same volume of tracking coverage, however they just changed the shape. And we can see here that on the MetaQuest 3 that it does not track as well above the head as the MetaQuest 2 does. But the trade-off there is that you get more tracking around your torso area, which may be more useful to some users. But I can see if you are a MetaQuest 2 user and maybe you are more in social games, you could probably be having your hands up more often. But if you're someone like me who plays FPS games, the MetaQuest 3 torso tracking may be more beneficial. So I think it's safe to say that it kind of really just depends on what games you play the most, what type of games you play the most. If you wanted a catch-all solution, I think the MetaQuest Touch Pro controllers are the way to go. They have cameras that track themselves, so you can have them above your head, you can have them behind your back, you can literally put them anywhere. And I mean anywhere. So let's actually just drill down into the specifications of each of the three controllers and discuss what makes them different. So I think I'm gonna just start off by highlighting the key differences between the three controllers. I alluded to this in the beginning of the video. The MetaQuest 3 Touch Plus controllers and the Touch Pro controllers actually drop the tracking ring, so you wouldn't have to worry about that possibly occluding or getting in the way of your tracking. The MetaQuest 2 still has the tracking ring that sometimes gets in the way when you're playing. Sometimes they smash into each other. Another key difference is the weight of the different controllers. The MetaQuest 3 Touch Plus controllers come in at 126 grams with a battery, which is actually the lightest controllers they have released. Second, you have the MetaQuest 2 Touch controllers, which are 126 grams without the battery. And then the beefiest controller they have is the MetaQuest Touch Pro controllers, coming in at 164 grams. So the weight and feel will differ between the three controllers in your hand. I personally prefer the MetaQuest Touch Pro controllers as they have a bit more heft and they just feel a bit more premium. The last key difference I want to highlight is that the MetaQuest 3 Touch Plus controllers actually has less visible tracking LEDs than the MetaQuest 2 Touch controller. So the MetaQuest 2 Touch controller has that tracking ring, where in the MetaQuest 3 Touch Plus controllers, they had to put it in the faceplate of the controller. So there's less visible tracking LEDs, which you would think would lead to less consistent tracking, but Meta has implemented improved tracking algorithms to make up for that difference. And I own all three of these controllers, and if I'm being quite honest, I really don't notice a difference between the MetaQuest 2 Touch controller tracking and the MetaQuest 3 Touch Plus controller tracking. So I think it all boils down to a preference. What I will say is that I believe that the MetaQuest Touch Pro controllers does provide the best tracking experience to MetaQuest headset users. But is it worth the $300 price point? That's up for you to decide. I wouldn't suggest upgrading to the MetaQuest 3 based on the tracking of the controllers alone. I think there are numerous other reasons that you would want to upgrade to the MetaQuest 3 headset. If you're on the MetaQuest 2, stick with your MetaQuest 2 Touch controllers. And if you want a better tracking experience, maybe buy the MetaQuest Touch Pro controllers. At the end of the day, it all boils down to you and what you're into. I personally think that the MetaQuest Touch Pro controllers are the best controllers out there. I recently just hit 1,000 subscribers. Actually, shouts out to iTutorial6332 for being my 1,000th subscriber. But when I look back on my journey through YouTube, I'm just really appreciative for all the opportunities I've had to learn and grow and develop my personal skills.